Speaking of evolution, we've got some evolution calls, and I'm gonna take them, Paul. I'm gonna take them. I've been patient. I haven't had an evolution call
I
on one of these shows in
I
like
got a
literally
drink. I'll just
30
sit and
years.
listen.
Let's do this thing. Okay, we're going with Anders first. Anders, he, him from Sweden. He's an atheist. He wants to talk about taxonomy, which is by all means. Anders, can you hear us? You are on the Sunday show.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. What
Indeed.
kind of taxonomy questions or concepts do you want to discuss briefly?
There
I
seems
say to
to be
myself.
two different methods to place being taxonomically, and I wonder what to do when they conflict.
Sure. What are your which two methods are you referring to? Genetics and morphology?
Well, first it's by descent. You don't outgrow your ancestry. So if my parents are a primate, then I'm a primate. That's one way.
Yeah, the
And
law of
then
monophily.
there's and then there's morphology, which says a primate has certain suites of characteristics, and among them are
Right.
primate dentition and yeah. So I never
Yeah,
developed any
totally.
wisdom teeth. I never had any tooth buds for wisdom teeth apparently. So I don't have the primate dentition pattern. Am I still a
So
primate?
yes, you are, because genetically, right, you have the markers to develop those wisdom teeth. It's just for whatever reason in your developmental cascade, they didn't end up developing. It was probably a quirk of your genome in particular. But taxonomy, too, doesn't typically apply on the individual level, it applies at the population level. So you can determine the status of something by looking at the general population characteristics. And at a population level, right, like all humans, generally have variation, but for the most part, we're born with our wisdom teeth. Now, the wisdom teeth isn't a character that we typically ascribe to primates. It's a catarrhine characteristic, right? Having that 2 1 2 3
Mhm.
over 2 1 2 3 dental formula. So, regardless, you would still be a primate, right? Like we have all the like a human. You'd be very hard pressed to find an individual who didn't have the primate characteristics. But it can happen, right? Like a person can be born with an abnormality where they end up only having 4 fingers on both their hands. Well, primates generally are described as having 5 fingers tipped in nails instead of claws. It's like, would they still be a primate? Yeah, they would, because generally the species has them, and developmentally they have them. They have that character too. It's just some kind of little genetic quirk that leads to it not being properly expressed. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, and I am satisfied with this answer. And good luck to you
Good.
both this evening. And actually, I'm a patron of Erica's, so I know you do good work.
Thank you, Anders. Yes, I thought
Thank you,
I
Anders.
recognized the name when I clicked on you. I was like, I could swear I know an Anders, but that's phenomenal. So thank you for calling in, and thank you for being a patron.
Mm, okay,
Take care, and I'm
you
glad the question was answered sufficiently.
take care.
So, what happens to a trait, Erica, that leaves a population? So, for example, I can't even think of an example, but so we don't have tails, right? Like, so I don't know if that's a great example, but at what point, that doesn't rule. It's the conflict between, I get the morphology and monophyly. Well, how do you say it?
Yeah, monophily. Yeah, you don't outgrow your
Monophily.
ancestry.
Yeah, so that's just gonna hold. Like in 5,000 years, maybe we decide that we don't need pinky toes, or we don't need feet at all. We're in a Wally situation, and we don't
Yeah.
we, just, we don't need feet at all. So we just they atrophy away. You know uh, so the rule of monophily doesn't actually affect morphology at all. It's more just saying who
So
your ancestor
okay, yeah,
was.
yeah, like so I get what you're saying. So, typically the characters that we use to identify members of a given taxonomic rank are intentionally devised so that they account for these types of abnormalities, right? Like so the characteristics of a primate, right? All of the primates that we know of have all of the primate characteristics without exception, right? All of the catarrhines that we know of have the catarrhine characteristics pretty much without exception, right? At a population level. Now, if you were to develop a characteristic, lose one of these characteristics as you descend, right? You're going
Hmm.
to have to change some of these taxonomic ranks because, and I maintain this, and I've maintained this for the entirety of my channel, right? Linnaean taxonomy is incredibly helpful, but it's not real in a biological sense, right? Like a species isn't a real thing in a biological sense. It's something that we use to help communicate what it is we're talking about, the group of organisms that we're talking about. Case in point, we've tried to find a species concept that works to define what a species is since Darwin. And in Origin of Species, Darwin talks about how we can't find one. And here we are over
Right.
150 years later, we still can't find one. Even genetics couldn't properly denote where one species ends and the next begins. And critically, that is exactly what was predicted and what is continues to be predicted by evolutionary theory, right? Like biology should be this big smudge. Critters shouldn't have these clear delineations. That's what creationism says, right? That creatures are created statically after their kind. Instead, what we see is a dynamic process. And as is always the case, when you try to apply a static concept to a dynamic process, you're going to fail. Things are going to slip through the cracks. So if it happened that we evolved, in 100,000 years or a million years, and every human alive didn't have their wisdom teeth anymore, then one of two things would happen. Either catarrhines would be described as these old world monkeys, of which we are old world monkeys. Either we would be described as having a dental formula of 2133 or 2132. That's what defines a catarrhine because of humans, or you would just remove that as a characteristic. Fortunately, I don't know of a single taxonomic rank that has like maybe there's one or two, but I can't think of one off the top of my head that's defined by only one character. So
Mm.
old world
Yeah.
monkeys would
Yeah.
still be described by numerous different characters, of which we would fall into. It's just you couldn't use that one character to define them anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and as a relatively recent young Earth creationist, right? It's a bit of a. I remember the struggle of like, wait, we're still
Mm.
fish, and because you think colloquially, and these phrases are used imprecisely, but that whole notion of wait, I don't have gills, so how am I still a fish, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, it's
I
more
know that
like,
fish is meaningless
yeah,
ultimately, but
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
ultimately it's meaningless, right? And there's not a character like there's not a this is what fish are, right? It's more like here are the characters that define a sarcopterygian as more specifically rather than like a chordate or a vertebrate. And it's like, yeah, well, we meet those criteria. It's not like fish isn't a real taxonomic category is really the
no,
problem, right? Like,
exactly. But
but it's a tough one.
in the on social media, these words are used imprecisely, and it actually creates some of this confusion that when you're on one side or the other actually helps to reinforce that the other side doesn't know what they're talking about sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and
Callers.
you see it like, yeah, people try to have these great, evolutionary resources. Like, I see the one every time. It's like a beacon to every creationist under the sun. But that the little animation that shows the Indo-Hyas evolve into a whale over time, right?
Hmm.
And it shows this one little cartoon creature, dip its toes in the water and slowly start swimming more and more and more. And before you know it, you've got a blue whale at the end. And it's like that's not a good way of presenting it because that's not what we proposed happened. Now, if you know the background, then you can sort of insert in your mind, like, okay, they're talking about groups begetting groups here. And obviously, this is happening across tens of millions of years. And no one is saying that specifically the species Rhodocetus gave rise to Dorodon. But because it's being shown in this sequence like this, creationists can sit back and be like, well, are you really suggesting that a single little creature the size of a house cat became a blue whale by swimming more often? And it's like, okay, I give up. Like we just need better
Yeah,
resources.
I
You got to
agree.
teach this at a basic level first, which is, that's what I try to do. try to do, but you can't whisper in everyone's
And
ear,
succeed
unfortunately.
for many,
Yeah,
for many.
that's the hope, right? Like that's
Mhm.
what fingers crossed.